Miles Davis is one of the most important musical and cultural icons of the 20th century. For more than 4 decades, from the late 40s to the early 90s, the trumpeter was the biggest star in jazz. But his influence and fame went far beyond that. Today, we're talking about Miles Davis, his life, his innovation, and how he changed music forever. Hello there, it's Warren Hewitt. I hope you're doing marvelously well. Welcome back to another episode of Artists That Change Music. If you haven't already, please subscribe. And if you hit the notification bell, you'll be notified when we have another video. And of course, you can always go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list and get a whole bunch of free goodies. Miles Davis once said, "I have to change. It's like a curse." Constant change was at the heart of Miles Davis's music. And as a result, he was at the forefront of several new musical genres. For him, regurgitating old hits was creative death. Normally, innovative artists are celebrated if they manage to change the course of music once. But astonishingly, Davis was at the forefront of cool jazz in 1949 to 50, hard bop in the mid-50s, modal jazz and orchestral jazz in the late 50s, and something that's been called avant bop in the mid-60s, jazz rock in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And because of this constant stylistic changes, Davis is often likened to Picasso. Several of Miles Davis's albums have been credited as having changed the course of music. Two that stand out most are Kinda Blue and Bitches Brew. Kinda Blue was released in 1959 during his modal jazz period and is widely regarded as the greatest jazz album of all time. It was a big influence on pretty much any kind of music. Bitches Brew, released in 1970, was both extremely influential and very controversial. The album's been called the Big Bang of jazz rock and mixed jazz with not only rock but also psychedelic, folk, and world music, as well as advanced studio production techniques. It greatly upset jazz purists, not least for being extremely popular at a time when jazz was in decline. Like many of his jazz colleagues, Davis, in the mid-60s, was playing to just a few dozen jazz fans in clubs in New York. But as a result of the crossover success of Bitches Brew, he played to more than 500,000 people at the Isle of Wight Festival in August 1970. While a folk purist at a live concert in Manchester in 1966 called Bob Dylan Judas for playing an electric guitar, jazz purists accused Miles of selling out and betraying jazz and good taste. But Davis had the last laugh, because his pioneering jazz rock experiments influenced several generations of jazz, rock, folk, electronic, and hip-hop musicians. Amongst them, Santana, Brian Eno, Radiohead, Prince, David Byrne, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, DJ Premier, Kendrick Lamar, and many, many more. Davis was also an amazing talent spotter who enlisted tons of unknown and up-and-coming musicians in his bands, many of whom went on to have stellar careers of their own. The list is unbelievably long, but includes John Coltrane, Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams, Chick Corea, Dave Holland, John McLaughlin, Billy Cobham, Lenny White, Marcus Miller, Mike Stern, John Scofield, and many more. And finally, Davis's keen dress sense, good looks, and larger-than-life charisma turned him into a style icon. As if pioneering several musical directions and being one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century was not enough, Davis has several more achievements to his name. As a trumpet player, Davis created a completely new trumpet sound, and his approach to playing the instrument changed forever how people hear the instrument. To help break down some specifics of Miles Davis's trumpet sound, I'm going to throw you over to my friend Ruth.
Hi, my name is Ruth Nichols, and I'm a trumpet player based in the Los Angeles area, and I'd like to talk to you about Miles today. There were trumpet greats like Dizzy Gillespie and a lot of the sweet band trumpet players like Harry James that were more popular in the day versus now. And these trumpet players were known for these full, brash, high, loud tones. They weren't associated necessarily with warmth, cool, calm, that sort of thing. So what Miles really did was exploit every tone he could manage to out of his trumpet. So he used the Harmon mute famously in a lot of his recordings. Kind of Blue, Someday My Prince Will Come. You can hear this guy. His Harmon mute was this Joe Rao bubble mute. Mine has a lot of dents in it. I imagine his did as well. They say that it sounds better, actually, with more dents. So part of the tone of the trumpet is very loud and very brash, depending on how you play it. But you put in a mute, and you can change the tone. So as an example of different things that Miles would do, he used space, and he also used these different tones. He would bend the notes by using his valves. It's done a little bit with your mouth here with the air, but also slowly moving the valve down instead of just quickly hitting it. So instead of as you can hear it, by using the half valve, slow valve depression method, it really helps with making the tone pop out. Great thing with the trumpet that Miles really utilized more than a lot of other trumpet players is his ability to bend notes. And not only bend them with his valves, but to bend the notes with his air. And there's this little pocket of air that is formed sometimes as like when you have too much air and it's a little bit of overflow that comes back. What you can do is just use that to bend the notes and slowly guide the air until it flares out, kind of like the shape of a trumpet. A lot of the time you could see Miles playing really far back or really far forward. A lot of teachers wouldn't necessarily tell their students to play with their trumpet like this, like he would. There's a Human Nature video, him covering the song Human Nature, and the real Kenny G playing a solo, but during his part, you can see him walking around stage, literally just doing that. And, as long as you have enough support from your diaphragm, it's not the best way to play trumpet, but it's totally fine when you're Miles Davis, I guess. Another way Miles used the trumpet was actually utilizing the constant danger of what trumpet players called fracking a note. And I think that he didn't let that stop him. So fracking a note is just, you kind of fudge the entrance of it. Like, you hear that kind of before that. So he actually utilized that in his solos and in his interpretations of different melodies. You can hear him use that along with valve bending, note bending, and quick note drop-offs, no vibrato, using a really dry tone in a way. And Miles really utilized those tools, which people would normally see as maybe making a mistake on the trumpet, but in actuality created even a bigger palette for him to work with when he was, creating these great works.
Thanks, Ruth. Now, in order to fully understand just how revolutionary his approach to the trumpet and jazz in general were, we need to rewind all the way back to the beginning. Miles Dewey Davis III was born in 1926 in Illinois and grew up in St. Louis. His father was a dentist, while his grandfather was a landowner, meaning they were all black middle class, which was remarkable for the time. According to Davis, his family also had a lot of Native American blood. Davis started playing trumpet at the age of 9 or 10, and already then something unusual happened, in that his trumpet teacher encouraged him not to use vibrato, which was at odds with the tendency at the time to play the trumpet with a loud, brash, full sound of vibrato. Let's take a listen to the Louis Armstrong song, I Ain't Got Nobody. In 1944, 18-year-old Davis moved to New York to attend Juilliard School of Music. But his true learning ground quickly became 52nd Street, often simply called The Street, where all the jazz clubs were located. It was here that he met saxophonist Charlie Parker and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie, the two leading stars of the bebop genre, which was in vogue at the time and which many still regard as the classic form of jazz. Davis dropped out of the college in 1945 and enjoyed his first recording session that same year. He became a sideman to Charlie Parker and immediately set himself apart by not only playing with a different trumpet sound, but also avoiding the virtuoso, super-fast playing that was a hallmark of bebop soloists at the time. Miles' aversion to this faster bebop style sowed the seeds for one of the aspects of his soloing style that he became famous for: his ability to convey more feeling by playing less, i.e. by leaving spaces. Less is more. He later explained, "I always listen for what I can leave out." Davis enjoyed his first recording session as leader in 1947. And in 1949, when he was still only 23, created his first epoch-making recording, The Birth of the Call. Though the album wouldn't be released until 1957, these tunes introduced the concept of cool to the jazz world dominated by frenetic bebop. The album was based on orchestral style arrangements, in part by Gil Evans, a composer and arranger Miles would work with for much of his life. The Birth of the Call remains one of the most influential jazz albums of all time. Let's take a listen to Boplicity from The Birth of the Call to hear what a big shift it was from bebop to cool jazz. Miles Davis traveled to Paris soon after the album's release, where he met Jean-Paul Sartre, Simeon de Beauvoir, and Picasso. But on his return to New York, he fell prey to heroin addiction. Davis struggled with substance addiction for much of his life, but in this instance managed to kick off cold turkey at his father's farm in 1953. This set off a period of enormous creativity. First of all, Miles' performance at the Newport Jazz Festival in 1955 created headlines. Not long afterwards, Miles formed what was to become his first great quintet, also featuring saxophonist John Coltrane, who was spotted by Miles and went on to become one of the biggest names in jazz. The second great quintet created several albums in a hard bop style that became all-time jazz classics. During this time with the second great quintet, Miles often used the Harmon mute, resulting in a softer, more breathy trumpet sound. It became part of his signature sound. By 1959, the quintet had become a sextet, and with some changes in personnel, they recorded Kind of Blue. Recorded over just 2 days, the musicians based themselves on brief melodic sketches that Davis had written down just before the session, rather than chord structures. This set the tone for modal jazz. Based on scales, i.e. modes, it was an approach that no one had been able to make work until that point. Modes have been widely used since Kind of Blue, also by improvising rock musicians, and it's part of the reason why the album can justifiably be called one of the most influential albums of any genre of all time. A great example of modal jazz style can be found in the song So What. This song is made up of 24 bars of one chord and 8 of another, leaving lots of space to explore within the Dorian mode. Parallel to all of this, Davis also recorded a number of innovative orchestral jazz albums with Gil Evans that further developed the foundations laid by Birth of the Call. 3 of these albums again became jazz classics: Miles Ahead, Porgy and Bess, and Sketches of Spain. The latter introduced Latin American and flamenco sounds to the jazz world, as well as prominent bass lines, which would become a feature of Davis's electric music. The 60s began for Davis with more health and addiction issues. For the first time in his life, he also found himself no longer at the cutting edge, as the new direction in jazz was free jazz, a genre related to the avant-garde in other arts that tried to get rid of old rules and conventions. Davis was not a fan and often publicly criticized the genre, stating, "You have to have some kind of form. You have to start somewhere." He also once said, "Play what you know and then play more than you know." His creative process clearly was based on building on tradition and going beyond it. Davis did this in spectacular fashion later on in the 60s, when he resurfaced with his second great quintet, with Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Herbie Hancock on piano, Ron Carter on bass, and Tony Williams on drums, who was only 17 years old when he joined the quintet. They played the style called avant bop. The name illustrates the fact that they were steeped in tradition, yet also experimenting greatly. The second great quintet recorded a number of now classic albums, amongst them Miles Smiles, Nefertiti, and Miles in the Sky. The 60s obviously was the time when rock and roll became the dominant force in popular music. Despite turning 40 in 1966, Miles Davis took it seriously. By contrast, most jazz artists and fans denounced rock and roll because of the long hair, the hippie clothes, and most of all, the basic, straight rhythms, simple harmonies, and perceived lack of skill amongst rock musicians. However, after some initial hesitation, Davis started to incorporate rock and folk and world music influences in his music. By the mid-60s, the second great quintet experimented with straight rhythms on some tracks, and in December of 1967, Davis invited an electric guitarist to the recording session, Joe Beck. 3 weeks later, he had an electric keyboard set up in the studio and asked Herbie Hancock to play it. On entering the studio, Hancock, who called himself a jazz snob at the time, thought, "I have to play on that toy?" Yet he went on to love electric keyboards and later went on to become one of the world's leading electronic musicians. Davis was already listening to Jimi Hendrix by that stage, as well as Sly Stone, James Brown, The Byrds, Aretha Franklin, and many other rock, funk, soul, and folk musicians. Reportedly, Hendrix and Davis jammed together in the latter's studio, but nothing was recorded. Jazz critics later claimed he was miming the fool's gold of rock and roll. But Miles had no time for outdated and prejudiced views of music. Instead, his journey into rock was just another step in the musical journey he began with the birth of the call. Strip down the harmonies, leave more spaces for the playing, and have more and more emphasis on the rhythm section. At one point, he explained that this was an exploration of the African roots of American music. Miles continued to experiment with this direction for the rest of the 60s, but the first time the public heard it was with the release of the classic jazz rock album, In a Silent Way, in 1969. The title is apt, as much of the album has an almost pastoral quality, and is indeed a precursor of ambient music, because In a Silent Way sounded relatively polite, and perhaps also because the album had more of a traditional jazz cover, it didn't yet shock the jazz purists. Nobody seemed to notice the extensive studio editing by producer Teo Macero, which included duplicating 6 minutes of music, presumably to stretch the musical material from a meager 32 minutes to 38 minutes. Let's take a listen to the first track from this album titled Shh, Peaceful, and hear this new rock-influenced Miles that incorporates electric guitar and driving hi-hats. Few people at the time realized the enormous changes that were afoot in Miles's music. On In a Silent Way, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, and Tony Williams remained from the second great quintet, which suggested continuity with the past. But there were two additional electric keyboardists, Chick Corea and Joe Zawinul, and most of all, the debut with Miles of two young British musicians who would go on to play a crucial role in Miles's music, bassist Dave Holland and guitarist John McLaughlin. Miles had discovered Holland in London when the latter was playing a gig at the famous Ronnie Scott's jazz club, and immediately invited the young man to New York. McLaughlin was 27 at the time and already a jazz guitarist with a bit of a track record. Tony Williams invited him to New York in early 1969, and when Davis got wind of this, he invited McLaughlin to the studio for the sessions that resulted in a Silent Way. This provided a wonderful example of Davis's approach to coaching musicians and getting the best out of them. In 1969, McLaughlin was already quite possibly the fastest and most technically gifted guitarist on the planet. He certainly got his label with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, which began in 1971. While McLaughlin was showing off his chops during the In a Silent Way sessions, Davis walked up to him and whispered into his ear, "Play as if you don't know how to play the guitar." In response, McLaughlin played a unique combination of rhythm and solo guitar simultaneously, a style he further developed on Bitches Brew. Bitches Brew was a development of In a Silent Way in many ways. Recorded over 3 days in August of 1969 and released in April the following year, it featured an even larger group of musicians, with not only 3 keyboardists, but on many tracks it had 2 bass players, 2 drummers, and 2 percussionists, all in the search for a huge rhythm section. Like with Kind of Blue and In a Silent Way, many of the tracks were improvisations on brief musical sketches supplied by Miles. They were knocked into shape even more with studio editing by producer Teo Macero. However, the music on Bitches Brew is more intense, it's faster, hard-hitting, and the grooves are deeper than on In a Silent Way. Add the psychedelic cover by Matty Klarwein, and the album clearly, totally unnerved the jazz purists, yet is now widely regarded as one of the best albums of all time. Bitches Brew is called the Big Bang of jazz rock, because not only was it musically enormously influential, in particular with rock musicians, in addition, almost all the musicians playing on it became founding fathers of the jazz rock genre. The same was the case for some of the other musicians who played with Davis around this time. Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter founded Weather Report. Chick Corea and drummer Lenny White and percussionist Erto Moreira founded Return to Forever. McLaughlin and Billy Cobham founded the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Bass clarinetist Benny Maupin played with Herbie Hancock's Mawandishi and Headhunters. Dave Holland and Jack DeJohnette also became band leaders in their own right, though their experiments remained closer to jazz. Miles Davis continued with his jazz rock experiments right until his death in 1991, meaning that his jazz and jazz rock periods are roughly of equal length. His next studio album after Bitches Brew was called A Tribute to Jack Johnson. It featured John McLaughlin, Herbie Hancock, Billy Cobham, as well as a very young bassist called Michael Henderson, who had played with Stevie Wonder. Recorded in 1970, it featured some of Miles and also some of McLaughlin's best playing. In further testimony to Miles' talent at getting the best out of sidemen, McLaughlin was once asked whether he agreed with the statement that the best playing of his career was when he played with Davis. He agreed. Around the same time as the recordings for Jack Johnson, McLaughlin also took part in a series of Davis live recordings that were released on an album called Live Evil. That also featured Keith Jarrett, another Miles sideman who later became a legend in his own right. The next big milestone was On the Corner, recorded and released in 1972. It is arguably Davis' most controversial album. It's been called the most hated album in jazz. And listening to it, it's not difficult to see why. A 13-piece band takes the search for a huge rhythm section to the limit. There's very little melody, only groove, and the addition of a sitar and a tabla player sees Miles also incorporating Indian elements. The big bass remains on one chord for much of the time, and combined with the multi-layered rhythms, the album became a huge influence on hip-hop. Although Hancock, McLaughlin, Corea, and Maupin were again present, the music remained a million miles away from the virtuoso speed fests of much other jazz rock. On the Corner laid the foundations for Miles' last musical journey into the stratosphere, his last genuinely successful attempt at breaking boundaries. Writer Paul Tingen called it the last frontier. The results were recorded on 3 astonishing live double albums. Black Magus, recorded in 1974, and Agatha and Pangea, both recorded on one day, February the 1st, 1975. The insane psychedelic funk on these 3 albums, which takes the intensity levels up to 12, if not 13, received very little recognition at the time. The music was so far ahead of their time, it still sounds totally fresh today. Most strikingly are the outrageous, visionary guitar solos by Pete Cozy, who Miles had enlisted as the closest thing to Hendrix. By September of 1975, Miles had reached the end of his creative road. Burnt out, struggling with drug addiction, and in extreme physical pain because of his hip and hernia issues, he had no option but to retire. With that, a 30-year-long whirlwind of creativity had come to an end. He did not take up the trumpet again until 1980. A year later, a comeback album was released, called The Man with the Horn. Although it was not his greatest effort, he had again talent-spotted several amazing musicians who would go on to do great things, most notably guitarist Mike Stern and bassist Marcus Miller. Davis's second post-retirement album, Star People, released in 1983, was a great improvement, introducing a new direction that could be called chromatic funk, as he drew heavily on edited versions of guitar solos by the new recruit to his band, John Scofield, who specialized in playing outside of the scale. The 1984 album Decoy saw Miles experimenting with the modern technology of the day, drum machines and synthesizers, mostly courtesy of Robert Irvin III. Miles switched from Columbia to Warner's in 1986 and the first release on his new label, Tutu. This created his superstar image, courtesy of the striking cover photo by Irving Penn. The music was for the most part composed and played by Marcus Miller, and the title song was immediately earmarked as a classic track, with a focus on melody over the groove bass experiments of the 70s. This set the tone for the last 5 years of Miles' life, which was very much a lap of honor, during which he received multiple awards and simply focused on playing good music. Having given up on initiating new directions, he made very few attempts at writing music, but instead enlisted others to write music for him, notably Marcus Miller and also Danish composer Paul Mikkelborg on the orchestral album Aura. His final studio album was Doo-Bop, on which he collaborated with co-writer and hip-hop producer Easy Moby. During the late 80s and early 90s, Miles also played on several film scores, notably music from Siesta, The Hotspot, and Dingo. Miles Davis died in Santa Monica on September the 18th, 1991, from a stroke, pneumonia, and a respiratory failure. He left behind him an incredible legacy of 51 studio albums, 36 live albums, 35 compilation albums, and 17 box sets, 4 soundtrack albums, 8 Grammy Awards, and the incredible feat of having changed the course of 20th century music not once, but at least 5 times over. Many of his recordings and achievements are still relevant today, and anyone interested in music is well advised to seek them out, enjoy them, and learn from them. Miles' hunger to always renew his music and seek new challenges remains a lesson for all of us. In the 70s, Miles told one of his musicians, "If you learn any of that old shit, you're fired." It was a clear lesson, as was the one he gave to a jazz fan who came up to him one day, also in the 70s, and said, "Miles, you're my man, but that new shit you're into, I just can't get with it." Miles answered, quick as a flash, "Should I wait for you?" Nearly 30 years after his passing, we're still catching up with Miles Davis. Thank you ever so much for watching. Please check out the other videos in this series. And let me know, is there Miles Davis music that's greatly influenced you? I know when I saw Miles play on his last tour, I was in tears the whole show. It was incredible. His music is moving to so many of us. Would love to know your experiences. If this is new for you and we're introducing you to Miles, just go check it out. Thank you ever so much for watching. Have a marvelous time. We'll see you all again very soon.